Sarah Mitchell's charcoal Audi cut through the crisp morning air of Washington, D.C., navigating the familiar streets she'd driven countless times before. The city was already alive with activity, but today felt different. Her Bluetooth chirped incessantly with messages from the West Wing. A developing crisis in Eastern Europe demanded immediate attention, and she was carrying classified briefings that could reshape American foreign policy. "Yes, I have the Thompson report." She spoke into her car's audio system, one hand adjusting her rearview mirror. The reflection showed a woman in her late 30s, her dark skin contrasting elegantly with her tailored navy suit. Her natural hair was styled professionally, every detail of her appearance calibrated for the corridors of power she navigated daily. The morning traffic performed its usual dance around Embassy Row, a ballet of brake lights and turn signals. Sarah checked her watch. 7:45 a.m. The president's briefing was at 8:15, and she still needed to clear security. Her Mercedes eased forward, muscle memory taking over as she approached the familiar stop sign at the corner of Massachusetts Avenue. That's when she saw it. A school bus stopped 2 blocks ahead, its yellow bulk promising at least 5 minutes of delay. Making a split-second decision, Sarah turned onto a side street, her usual shortcut when time wasn't on her side. The stop sign at the corner was typically deserted at this hour. She slowed, but didn't quite come to a complete stop before making her turn. The flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror came as an unwelcome surprise. "Not today," Sarah muttered, carefully pulling over to the curb. Her phone buzzed again, a text from the Chief of Staff. "Where are those briefing papers?" She took a deep breath, reminding herself of the protocol she'd learned during her years in Washington. Remain calm, be professional, no sudden movements. The officer approached, a young man with close-cropped hair and a crisp uniform. Sarah already had her license and registration ready, hands visible on the steering wheel. "Good morning, officer," she said, her voice carrying the same measured tone she used in diplomatic negotiations. "Do you know why I pulled you over today, ma'am?" The officer's tone was routine, but Sarah noticed his hand resting casually on his holster, a detail that made her heart rate tick up slightly. "I apologize if I didn't come to a complete stop. I'm actually heading to an emergency meeting at the White House, and I'm carrying time-sensitive documents." She gestured to her briefcase in the passenger seat, with its official government tags clearly visible. The officer's expression didn't change. "Everyone in D.C. has an important meeting, ma'am. License and registration, please." Sarah handed over her credentials, watching in the side mirror as the officer returned to his patrol car. Her phone buzzed again. Now the president's deputy chief of staff was asking for updates. The weight of the classified documents in her briefcase felt heavier with each passing minute. When the officer returned, he was already writing a ticket. "I'm citing you for failure to come to a complete stop. This carries a $250 fine, and you'll need to appear in traffic court next Tuesday at 9 a.m. "Officer, I understand the violation, but perhaps we could." "Sign here, please," he interrupted, holding out the ticket. "This is not an admission of guilt, just acknowledging you received the citation." Sarah signed the ticket, her Mont Blanc pen leaving a precise signature on the paper. As the officer walked away, she noticed him glance at her car's government plates, then double-check something on his ticket pad. But he kept walking. Pulling back into traffic, Sarah checked the time, 8:05 a.m. She was now officially late for one of the most important briefings of her career. Her phone rang again, this time displaying blocked number, the secure line used only for highest priority communications. As she accelerated toward the White House security checkpoint, Sarah tucked the ticket into her briefcase. In her world of international diplomacy and high-stakes policy decisions, a traffic violation should have been a minor inconvenience. But something about the interaction left her uneasy, a familiar knot in her stomach that had nothing to do with the morning's brewing international crisis. The fluorescent lights of D.C.'s Superior Court buzzed overhead as Sarah sat in Courtroom B, her laptop balanced discreetly on her knees. She'd managed to schedule this court appearance between a Senate committee briefing and a diplomatic lunch with the French ambassador. The wooden bench was hard, but her posture remained impeccable. Years of White House meetings had trained her well. Judge William Harrison presided over the morning's cases with mechanical efficiency from her seat in the fourth row. Sarah observed his patterns. A middle-aged man with graying temples and wire-rimmed glasses, he carried himself with the assured authority of someone who'd spent decades behind the bench. His black robe seemed to absorb the harsh courtroom lighting, making him appear more imposing than his actual stature suggested. Reduced to $75. Next case, he announced, dismissing a young white college student who'd been caught speeding. The girl had barely finished her tearful explanation about rushing to her grandmother's birthday before receiving the judge's mercy. Sarah made a mental note. Harrison responded well to emotional appeals. 2 rows ahead, a Hispanic man tried to explain his broken taillight through a court interpreter. Harrison's patience visibly thinned. The law is clear. Mr. Rodriguez, $150 fine. Next case. The entire interaction lasted less than 2 minutes. Sarah's phone vibrated silently. A message from the president's chief of staff about an emerging situation with North Korea. She began typing a response when the court clerk's voice cut through her concentration. Case number 2347B. Sarah Mitchell. Traffic violation. Failure to stop. The clicking of her heels echoed through the courtroom as she approached the podium. She felt Judge Harrison's gaze track her movement, taking in her Armani suit, her leather briefcase, her confident stride. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or something else she couldn't quite read. Ms. Mitchell, he began, glancing at her citation, you failed to come to a complete stop at an intersection on Embassy Row. How do you plead? Your Honor, while I acknowledge not coming to a complete stop, I'd like to explain the circumstances. Sarah's voice carried the same authority she used in White House Situation Rooms. That morning, I was carrying time-sensitive national security documents. Ms. Mitchell, Harrison interrupted, his tone sharp, are you suggesting that national security requires disregarding traffic laws? A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Sarah maintained her composure, though she noticed the judge's tone differed markedly from his earlier interactions. No, Your Honor, I'm simply providing context. I have a clean driving record, and this was an unusual circumstance where. This court sees unusual circumstances every day, Ms. Mitchell. Harrison's fingers drummed on his desk. The law applies equally to everyone, regardless of their position. Something in his emphasis made Sarah's jaw tighten. She'd heard that tone before, in countless meetings where her credentials were subtly questioned, her authority quietly undermined. Of course, Your Honor, I completely agree about equality under the law. She reached into her briefcase. I have letters from my supervisor at the White House and. That won't be necessary. Harrison's hand cut through the air. This court is not impressed by attempts to leverage professional connections. His voice carried clearly through the now silent courtroom. The fine stands at $250, plus $75 in court costs. Next case. Sarah remained at the podium for a moment, her hand still on her briefcase. Through the windows behind Judge Harrison, she could see the Capitol dome rising in the distance, a symbol of the justice and equality she worked to protect every day. The irony wasn't lost on her. Thank you, Your Honor, she said finally, her voice level but carrying a weight that made Harrison look up from his papers. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, Sarah saw what she'd seen countless times before, not hatred or overt prejudice, but something more insidious, assumptions, biases, the quiet prejudgments that shaped so many interactions in her world. As she walked back through the courtroom, her phone buzzed again. The French ambassador's office was confirming lunch, where they'd discuss international justice and human rights. Sarah allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Sometimes, the universe had a sense of humor, even if the joke wasn't particularly funny. The tension in courtroom B had shifted noticeably since Sarah's case began. Even the court reporter's fingers seemed to hover more attentively over her stenotype machine, capturing every word of the increasingly charged exchange. The afternoon sun slanted through the high windows, casting long shadows across the judicial seal mounted behind Judge Harrison's bench. "Ms. Mitchell," Harrison continued, shuffling through her paperwork with deliberate slowness, "you mentioned your position at the White House. Would you have us believe that your employment status should influence these proceedings?" His emphasis on employment status hung in the air like static before a storm. Sarah straightened, her shoulders squaring beneath her suit jacket. She'd navigated countless diplomatic crises, faced down hostile foreign ministers, but something about this moment felt different, more personal, more fundamental. "Your Honor, I mentioned my position solely to provide context for the urgency of that morning. The documents I was carrying were classified and time-sensitive." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "I'm actually glad you raised this point about equal treatment under the law." Harrison's eyebrows lifted slightly. The bailiff, who had been maintaining a professional distance, shifted his weight, sensing the change in atmosphere. "Oh," Harrison leaned forward. "Please, enlighten us." His tone carried a warning, but Sarah had faced down worse threats across international negotiating tables. "I've been in this courtroom for the past hour, Your Honor. I observed as you reduced fines for 3 other citizens who rolled through stop signs. Mr. Peterson's fine was reduced to $75, Ms. Thompson's to $100, and Mr. Wagner's was dismissed entirely." Sarah maintained direct eye contact with the judge. Their circumstances were remarkably similar to mine. A muscle twitched in Harrison's jaw. The courtroom had fallen so silent that the distant sound of traffic filtered in through the windows. The court clerk had stopped shuffling papers, watching the exchange with poorly concealed interest. "Ms. Mitchell, are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything, Your Honor. I'm stating facts that are recorded in today's proceedings." Sarah's voice remained measured, professional. "As someone who works daily to uphold our nation's principles of equality and justice, I find it educational to see these principles in action at every level of our system." Judge Harrison's face flushed. He glanced at the gallery, now hanging on every word, then at his clerk, who quickly looked down at her papers. The weight of the moment seemed to press down on the entire courtroom. "Your Honor," Sarah continued, her voice softening slightly, "I'm happy to pay an appropriate fine for my violation. I only ask that it be consistent with the precedents you've set today." Harrison's hands gripped the edge of his bench. The sun had shifted, and now the shadow of the window's iron bars fell across his face like prison stripes. For a moment, he seemed to be waging an internal battle. "Ms. Mitchell, this court does not appreciate being lectured on justice by." He caught himself, but not quite quickly enough. The unfinished sentence echoed in the silence. "By whom, Your Honor?" Sarah's question was quiet but clear. The courtroom held its breath. Even the bailiff had forgotten his usual stoic expression, watching the scene unfold with undisguised interest. Finally, Harrison spoke, his voice strained. "The fine stands at $250, plus court costs. This is not a debate club, Ms. Mitchell. This is a court of law." He raised his gavel. "Next case." As Sarah gathered her belongings, she became aware of the eyes following her. Sympathetic glances from other defendants, thoughtful looks from the court staff, and one particularly intense stare from a woman in the back who was scribbling furiously in a reporter's notebook. Her phone buzzed as she reached the courtroom doors. A text from the President's Chief of Staff. "Need you in the Situation Room. NK situation escalating." Sarah allowed herself a small, ironic smile. From one power play to another. Before leaving, she turned for one last look at Judge Harrison, who was already calling the next case, his voice slightly louder than necessary. He didn't look up, but his hands still gripped the bench too tightly, and the shadow of the window bars continued to stripe his robe like a prison uniform of his own making. Judge William Harrison slouched into his leather recliner, loosening his bow tie with one hand while reaching for the remote with the other. His house in Georgetown was quiet except for the gentle hum of the central heating and the ice cubes clinking in his glass of 18-year-old Macallan Scotch. The day's cases still weighed on his mind, though he couldn't quite pinpoint why. "You were harsh today, Vil," his wife Catherine had commented during dinner, before leaving for her hospital night shift. She'd been in the courtroom gallery, something she did occasionally to keep him honest, as she liked to say. He'd dismissed her concern with a wave of his fork, but now, in the solitude of his study, her words nagged at him. The evening news droned in the background as he reviewed some case files. Anderson Cooper's voice provided a familiar white noise until a particular phrase caught his attention. White House response to the North Korean missile tests. Harrison glanced up, more out of habit than interest. His Scotch glass froze halfway to his lips. There, standing at the White House press podium, was Sarah Mitchell. But this wasn't the same woman who had stood in his courtroom. This Sarah Mitchell wore the same impeccable suit, the same confident posture, but now she radiated authority as she fielded questions from the world's press court. Senior Policy Advisor Sarah Mitchell reiterated the administration's stance. The chyron scrolled beneath her image, listing credentials that made Harrison's stomach clench. Harvard Law, magna cum laude, Rhodes Scholar, former UN Ambassador, Chief Advisor on International Security. His Scotch glass thudded onto the side table, sloshing liquid onto his court papers. On screen, Sarah was handling a particularly aggressive question from a British reporter about nuclear proliferation. Her response was diplomatic yet firm, showcasing a deep understanding of international law and global politics. The entire White House press corps hung on her every word. "Catherine," he called out, before remembering his wife was at the hospital. He needed to share this revelation with someone, to process the reality of who had really stood in his courtroom that morning. A new segment began, showing Sarah in the Situation Room, seated 2 chairs away from the president. Another clip, Sarah shaking hands with the Chinese premier at a state dinner. Then Sarah testifying before Congress, her expertise evident in every measured response. Harrison's hand shook slightly as he grabbed his phone, pulling up the court records from that morning. He found her case file and began reading it with new eyes. Every detail he'd dismissed, every credential he'd ignored, her White House position, her security clearance, her diplomatic status, now bore a devastating new weight. He remembered his dismissive tone, his interruptions, the way he'd almost said, what exactly had he been about to say? This court does not appreciate being lectured on justice by whom? A black woman, a civilian. The memory made him wince. The TV continued its coverage. Now Sarah was announcing a breakthrough in Middle East peace negotiations, her gravitas undeniable as she outlined complex diplomatic agreements. The reporter described her as one of the administration's most trusted advisors and a key architect of modern American foreign policy. Harrison reached for his scotch again, but his hand was shaking too much. In his mind, he kept seeing her in his courtroom, maintaining perfect composure as he treated her with condescension. He remembered the small smile she'd given him as she left. Not angry, not defeated, but knowing. As if she'd seen right through him to something he hadn't even seen in himself. His phone buzzed. A text from Catherine. "Just saw Sarah Mitchell on the news in the hospital break room. Isn't that the woman from court today? The one you..." He didn't read the rest. Instead, he pulled up the court's electronic system and began reviewing his cases from the past month, then the past year. A pattern started emerging in his traffic court rulings, a pattern he'd never noticed before, or perhaps had chosen not to notice. The numbers stared back at him from his tablet screen while on the TV. Sarah Mitchell continued to shape world events, her authority and expertise undeniable. The contrast between his treatment of her and her actual stature made him feel small in his expensive leather recliner, the taste of scotch turning bitter in his mouth. The digital clock on Judge Harrison's desk blinked 2:17 a.m., its red numbers casting a faint glow across scattered legal papers and an empty Scotch glass. He'd been in his chambers for hours, the courthouse silent except for the occasional distant sound of the night cleaning crew. On his computer screen, video footage from that morning's traffic court played on a loop. Case number 2347B, Sarah Mitchell. He'd watched it 17 times now, each viewing more painful than the last. In the harsh fluorescent lighting of the courtroom footage, his biases were laid bare with brutal clarity. The way his posture changed when she approached the podium, the subtle shift in his tone, the almost imperceptible curl of his lip when she mentioned her White House position. Your Honor, I observed as you reduced fines for 3 other citizens. Harrison paused the video on Sarah's face as she delivered that line. Her expression was composed, professional, but her eyes knew. They held decades of similar moments, of having to maintain dignity in the face of casual dismissal. He pulled up another file on his second monitor, a spreadsheet of his rulings from the past 5 years. The data analysis software had finished its work, generating charts and statistics that made him feel physically ill. Average fines by race, conviction rates by gender, leniency patterns by zip code. The numbers didn't lie, and they painted a damning picture. A knock at his chamber door made him start. Bill? It was Judge Martinez, his colleague from the 3rd floor. The cleaning crew said they saw your light on. It's almost 2:30 in the morning. Harrison quickly minimized the video, but left the statistics visible. Come in, Alina. Judge Martinez entered, still in her court attire. She'd probably been working late on the Thompson case. Her eyes swept over the chaos of his usually immaculate desk, lingering on the spreadsheets. That's quite a data analysis, she observed, pulling up a chair. What prompted this? Harrison ran a hand through his disheveled hair. Did you see the news tonight? Sarah Mitchell, the White House advisor. Of course, the North Korea situation. She handled it brilliantly. Martins paused, studying his face. Why? She was in my courtroom this morning. Traffic violation. He swiveled his monitor so she could see the statistics. I treated her like I was. He struggled to find the words. Ah. Martina's expression softened with understanding. And now you're doing a deep dive into your ruling history. Look at these numbers, Alina. The patterns are undeniable. All these years, I've prided myself on being fair, on following the law. But these statistics, he gestured at the screen, where a particularly damning graph showed disparities in fine amounts. I've been carrying these biases, these prejudices, and I never even saw them. Or maybe I didn't want to see them. Martinez was quiet for a moment, watching the paused video frame of Sarah Mitchell. You know, Bill, recognizing it is the first step. But it can't be the only step. I've been thinking about that mandatory bias training the board suggested last year. Harrison pulled up another document, the one we all dismissed as unnecessary political correctness. The one you called feel-good nonsense for the liberal agenda. Martins raised an eyebrow. Harrison winced. I've already drafted an email to the board endorsing it. But it's not enough. The whole system needs examination. Today, I watched myself perpetuate the very inequalities I swore an oath to prevent. He stood up, walking to his chamber window. The Capitol dome glowed in the distance, a reminder of the ideals he pledged to uphold. You know what the worst part is? She knew. Sarah Mitchell stood there, enduring my condescension, while carrying the weight of international diplomacy on her shoulders. She saw right through me, saw what I couldn't see in myself. Martinez joined him at the window. So what are you going to do about it? Harrison turned back to his desk, where the spreadsheets still displayed their uncomfortable truths. First, I need to make this right with her. Then, he gestured at the data. Then we need to make sure this never happens again. Not in my courtroom. Not in any courtroom. The clock blinked 2:30 a.m., marking the moment a judge began to rewrite his own verdict. The next morning's newspaper sat untouched on Judge Harrison's desk, Sarah Mitchell's face on the front page beside headlines about diplomatic breakthroughs. Dark circles shadowed his eyes as he pored over 20 years of court records, each page adding weight to his growing dismay. "Your 9 o'clock is here," his clerk announced, poking her head into his chambers. "Cancel everything today, Susan," Harrison replied, not looking up from his computer screen. "And get me Judge Thompson from the Ethics Committee." The patterns in his rulings were impossible to ignore now. African American defendants received fines averaging 35% higher than their white counterparts for identical violations. Women of color faced skepticism about their professional credentials at twice the rate of other defendants. The data spanned his entire career, a digital archive of unconscious bias. His phone buzzed. Another news alert about Sarah Mitchell. She was photographed leaving Air Force One, briefcase in hand, having just negotiated a crucial treaty in Geneva. The same briefcase she carried in his courtroom, containing documents that probably shaped international policy. "Bill." Judge Thompson's voice preceded him into the office. The Ethics Committee chair paused at the sight of Harrison's disheveled appearance. "You look like hell." "James, sit down. You need to see this." Harrison turned his monitor, displaying charts and graphs that told a 20-year story of judicial bias. "And that's just the beginning." Thompson leaned forward, glasses perched on his nose. "These are your cases, every single one." Harrison stood, pacing behind his desk. "Remember last month when you proposed that comprehensive bias audit for the district court? The one you called unnecessary bureaucratic overreach. I was wrong." Harrison stopped pacing, facing his colleague. "Dead wrong. And I need your help to fix it." For the next hour, they discussed implementation plans for court-wide bias training, statistical monitoring of rulings, and independent review boards. Harrison's hand shook slightly as he signed the formal request for an ethics review of his own conduct. "You understand this could affect your standing on the bench?" Thompson asked, holding the signed document. "It should," Harrison replied, thinking of Sarah Mitchell maintaining her composure in his courtroom while carrying the weight of international diplomacy. "The system only works if we hold ourselves accountable." Later that afternoon, Harrison sat in his car outside the courthouse, staring at the draft of a letter on his laptop. "Dear Ms. Mitchell, 20 years on the bench, and I've never written a letter like this. Yesterday in my courtroom, I failed not only you but the very principles of justice I swore to uphold." He deleted it. Started again. "Dear Senior Advisor Mitchell, your presence in my courtroom yesterday held up a mirror I've been avoiding for decades." Delete. Another attempt. "Ms. Mitchell, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you, and countless others who have stood before me, a change." His phone rang. Judge Martinez. "Did you see the latest?" she asked without preamble. "Your traffic court incident made page 6. White House senior advisor faces questionable treatment in local court." Harrison's stomach dropped. He pulled up the article on his phone, reading quotes from other attendees in the courtroom that day. The reporter had done her homework, comparing his rulings and noting the disparities Sarah had pointed out. "It's all true, Elena," he said quietly. "Every word." "I know," she replied. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Harrison looked up at the courthouse, its marble columns stark against the afternoon sky. Inside those walls, he'd dispensed what he'd thought was justice. Now he understood. True justice required more than just following the law. It demanded constant self-examination, uncomfortable truths, and the courage to change. He turned back to his laptop and began writing again. "Dear Ms. Mitchell, yesterday you entered my courtroom carrying documents that could change the world. Today I realize you changed my world instead. This time," he kept writing. The letter sat unopened on Sarah Mitchell's mahogany desk in the West Wing, competing for attention with classified briefings and diplomatic cables. Her assistant had flagged it as unusual, hand-delivered from Judge William Harrison's chambers, marked personal and confidential. "The UN Secretary General is on line 1. her assistant called through the intercom. "Give me 5 minutes, Claire," Sarah responded, finally picking up the envelope. The paper was expensive, heavy, the kind used for official court documents. She broke the seal with a silver letter opener, a gift from the French ambassador. "Dear Ms. Mitchell," she read silently, her expression unchanging as she absorbed Harrison's words. The letter was surprisingly raw, stripped of legal jargon and judicial authority. It laid bare not just an apology, but a man's confrontation with his own biases, followed by concrete actions he'd already set in motion. Her phone buzzed again. The president needed her input on a developing situation in the Middle East. But for once, international crisis could wait. This moment demanded her full attention. 3 days later, Sarah sat in a corner booth at the Blue Duck Tavern, away from the usual Washington power lunch crowd. She'd chosen this spot deliberately, neutral ground, neither courthouse nor White House territory. Judge Harrison arrived exactly on time, looking somehow smaller without his robes. "Ms. Mitchell," he began, sliding into the booth. "Sarah," she corrected, studying him over her untouched water glass. "You wrote me a letter about truth, Judge Harrison. Let's begin with first names." "Bill," he offered, his voice carrying the hint of relief. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." A waiter approached, but Sarah waved him away with the practiced grace of a seasoned diplomat. "Your letter mentions specific changes you're implementing in the court system. Walk me through them." For the next hour, Harrison detailed his action plan: mandatory bias training, statistical monitoring of rulings, regular audits, community oversight boards. Sarah listened with the same intensity she brought to international negotiations, occasionally asking pointed questions that revealed gaps he hadn't considered. "You're proposing systemic changes," she observed, finally picking up her water glass. "But what about personal ones?" Harrison met her gaze directly for the first time. "I've spent my career believing I was colorblind, that Lady Justice's blindfold meant ignoring differences rather than acknowledging them. I was wrong. And now I understand that true justice requires seeing clearly, seeing people fully, including the barriers and battles they face that I've never had to consider." Sarah nodded slowly, reaching for her briefcase. "I brought something for you." She pulled out a folder containing statistics on racial disparities in the judicial system nationwide. "Your courtroom isn't unique, Bill, but your response to discovering these patterns could be." "I'd like your input," Harrison said, surprising himself. "Your experience, both personal and professional, could help shape these reforms. You're asking a defendant you unfairly penalized to help fix the system." Sarah's tone was neutral, diplomatic. "I'm asking a highly qualified policy expert who had the courage to speak truth to power, even from a position of disadvantage." Harrison paused. "And yes, I recognize the irony." A slight smile crossed Sarah's face. The White House might have some interest in local judicial reform initiatives that could serve as national models. "Is that a yes?" "It's a maybe." Sarah checked her phone. 5 missed calls from the Situation Room. "I have to go. There's a crisis in." "Of course." Harrison stood as she gathered her things. "Thank you for hearing me out." Sarah paused, briefcase in hand. "You know, the hardest part of diplomacy isn't getting everyone to agree. It's getting them to acknowledge there's a problem in the first place. You've taken that step. The question is, how many of your colleagues are ready to do the same?" "I don't know," Harrison admitted, "but I know where to start." As Sarah walked out, her phone already at her ear managing some distant international crisis, Harrison remained at the table, looking at the statistics she'd left behind. The numbers told a familiar story, but now he was ready to help write a different ending. 6 months later, Judge Harrison stood at a podium in the courthouse rotunda, facing a crowd of reporters, judges, and community leaders. The marble walls echoed with quiet murmurs as he adjusted his reading glasses, glancing at Sarah Mitchell, who sat in the front row beside his wife Catherine. "The Capital Justice Initiative launches today," he began, his voice carrying the weight of both authority and humility. But its true beginning was on a routine morning in traffic court, when one defendant held up a mirror to our justice system, and to myself. The initiative's preliminary report lay before each attendee, 50 pages of data, recommendations, and concrete reforms already being implemented. Sarah had spent countless early mornings and late nights helping refine the proposals, bringing her diplomatic skills to the delicate task of transforming an entrenched system. In our first 3 months of enhanced oversight, Harrison continued, we've identified disturbing patterns in sentencing across all courts in our district, but more importantly, we've begun to correct them. He gestured to a series of charts displayed on screens behind him, showing dramatic reductions in discriminatory sentencing patterns. From her seat, Sarah watched the judge she'd once faced in traffic court. His transformation had been remarkable, yet she knew it was just the beginning. Her phone buzzed silently, probably the Secretary of State about the upcoming UN summit. But for once, international diplomacy could wait. We've implemented mandatory bias training, Harrison was saying, but not the superficial kind that checks boxes. Real training with ongoing oversight and accountability. He paused, making eye contact with various colleagues in the audience. And yes, some of us found it uncomfortable. Growth usually is. In the months since their coffee shop meeting, 23 other judges had voluntarily submitted their records for review. 17 had found similar patterns in their rulings. 12 had already made significant changes to their sentencing practices. But numbers alone don't tell the whole story, Harrison continued. Behind every statistic is a person who came to these courts seeking justice. They deserved better than what they received. Today, we begin to make that right. Sarah's attention was drawn to a young black woman in the back of the room, a law student who'd been interning with the initiative. She was furiously taking notes, occasionally glancing up at Harrison, with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Sarah recognized that look. She'd worn it herself many times. This initiative isn't just about our courts, Harrison said, approaching his conclusion. It's about creating a model that can be implemented nationwide. Already, judicial districts in 5 states have requested our framework. Catherine Harrison reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. Both women understood the cost of this moment. The late nights Harrison had spent reviewing cases, the political battles he'd fought with resistant colleagues, the anonymous threats from those who opposed change. Someone wise once told me, Harrison said, looking directly at Sarah, that the hardest part isn't getting everyone to agree. It's getting them to acknowledge there's a problem in the first place. Today, we do more than acknowledge. Today we act. The applause was polite but meaningful. As reporters rushed forward with questions, Sarah slipped out a side door. She had a meeting at the White House, where she'd be presenting a proposal to expand the initiative's framework nationally. Her phone buzzed again, this time a text from Judge Harrison. Thank you for giving me the chance to change. Sarah smiled, typing back, thank you for taking it. As she walked to her car, she passed the traffic intersection, where this had all begun 6 months ago. The stop sign still stood there, unchanged. But everything else, from the judges who served in the courthouse behind her to the very nature of justice in their district, was different. Her phone rang again. Ms. Mitchell, her assistant said, the president is asking about the UN summit prep. Tell him I'm on my way. Sarah replied, sliding into her car. And Claire, remember that traffic court story I told you about? Pull the initiative's data for me. I think it's time to take this conversation global. She drove away from the courthouse, coming to a complete stop at the sign. In her rearview mirror, she could see the building where justice was not just blind anymore, but finally beginning to see.